Welcome everyone. I'm Glenda Dawson. I have LD here, and you're watching Glenda's Dragon's Den. Glenda's Dragon's Den can be found on the Glenda's Magical Creations on the Conscious Awakening Network, on Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, and many other streaming platforms. Today we have a very interesting, well, two very interesting guests. And I am just going to basically present them, and they will tell you all about themselves and everything that they're here to show us and talk to us about. So Dennis Stone, Mark, welcome.
I thought this was the Rocky and Bullwinkle show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on today.
I'm Boris.
Thank you.
I'm Bullwinkle.
I guess the site is the Rocky place. That's where I was going with that.
We got it all.
So Dennis, tell us about yourself and what it is that you would like to leave our audience with today.
Well, yes, I'm Dennis Stone, of course, and with the owners and operators of a place called America's Stonehenge. It's a place that's located in North Salem, New Hampshire. And my family's involvement with it has been going on since 1955. I was about 18 months old when my dad actually got involved with the site. And I grew up with this site all my whole life. I started working there in 1968, putting bumper stickers on cars and guiding in 1970. And although I always stayed with the place and, worked, did research, study, I got into the airlines back in 1974. I began my flying lessons, went to college, and got my first flying job in 1980. It took a while to build hours. Back in those days, it was kind of a slow process. But in the meantime, I still worked at our museum as a guide and, again, doing research, study of the site. And I just finished up my my flying career in 2016 after 35 years of being with the airlines. I flew a total of 42 years. It took me to a lot of different places, similar to our site, actually, not only around the Northeast, but overseas. Our site is a complex of stone structures on a hill, about 360 feet above sea level, 40 miles north of Boston, about 20 miles from the coast. There really shouldn't be here. According to authorities, mainstream archaeologists, historians, scholars, and others, the site and other sites in the Northeast really shouldn't be around. Their explanation is that these sites are built by farmers. Today, the number of these sites are about 800 from Quebec all the way down to Virginia. But our site's kind of particular in its size, its shape, and the concentration of structures in one area. It's kind of like the Reader's Digest. We got all these stone structures, chambers, stone walls on about 110 acres. And yet there are other sites like North Stonington, Connecticut, with 8,000 stone features. There are 25 categories of structures, very similar to the same thing you'll see at our site, but they're scattered over 35,000 acres of the town of North Stonington, Connecticut. And next door is the Gunjewamp site, similar to ours, about 250 acres, kind of spread out with similar stone structures and standing stones, etc. The site, we think, is an ancient ceremonial site. And we have dated it using 12 different carbon dating starting in 1967 through 1995. And more recently, in 2020, we took soil samples of what they call sediment cores of different structures and sent to a laboratory in the University of Washington out in Seattle. Dr. Feathers flew out and he did our site and 22 sites from here to Virginia. It's $1,000 per core. And we took 4 cores, 2 cores tested, 2 cores did not test. And that was typical of a couple other sites too. And the results coming back is it's pre-colonial. The earth it's actually a dating of dirt. And how long was the dirt next to a wall or on top of a chamber and hadn't seen the light of day. So we have that supporting the carbon datings that the site is prehistoric. It's also an astronomically aligned site with the heavens. We have 57 alignments with the sun, the moon, and the stars. And that work began in 1965. That was about 7 years after we opened the site to the public for the first time. We began clearing out the trees after we heard about a show called The Mystery of Stonehenge on CBS. It was based on a book by Gerald Hopkins from England, who was actually working at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Cambridge, Mass. So he was on this side of the ocean doing work, and he wrote a book called Stonehenge Decoded, which became very, very popular in the 60s. And we used to sell that book, I guess, in our visitor center into the 1970s. But that book raised a lot of interest, not only at our site and other sites too, where some of these sites set up in alignment with the sun, perhaps, maybe the moon during the different cycles. And so that work began in 65 at our site. And today we think we have 57 alignments, again, with the sun, moon, and stars. And so we call it an astronomically aligned site. But we opened in 1958. My dad first heard about it on a radio show on a Friday evening in 1955 during the summer. And it was one of the biggest radio stations in New England. It's out of Boston. It was WBZ. They're still going strong today. On a Friday night, the show was called Yankee Yarns. And the host was Alton Hall Blackington. Originally from Maine. I guess he would go to the studio and he would do a show on Friday nights at 7:30, and it would run for an hour or two. I can't remember the actual length of the show. But on a Friday night, my dad's listening to it like he always listened to it, and it was all about this site. And it really kind of blew his mind that these stone ruins, the mystery of them, and the way they describe the structures and everything, it just kind of really blew him away. And he only lived 7 miles from the site. He had never heard of the place. And my mom hadn't either. And because I was only 18 months old and I hadn't heard about it. The following week, he was at a barber shop having his hair done. And while I was waiting to have his hair done, he actually picked up a magazine. And while I was flipping through it, I saw this article. And the article was all about this same site with photographs. And now he's got pictures of the site. He's got a whole article of the site. He turned to the barber who was doing somebody else's hair. And he was actually the owner of the shop. His name was Warren Haywood. And he said, "Hey, Warren, can I keep this magazine?" He goes, "Well, how old is that?" He goes, "Well," my dad goes, "it's 1952. It's been sitting here for 3 years." He goes, "Go ahead and take it." The weekend, they're at my aunt and uncle's in the same town, about 7 or 8 miles from the site. And about 10 people playing cards, having some beer, I guess, and sitting around talking and just enjoying. They did that on Saturdays, kind of a tradition. My dad took the magazine out and passed it to everybody. Nobody knew what the site was either, until it got to my aunt and uncle, my mom's sister and her brother-in-law. They picked it up, they looked at it and said, "Wait a minute, we used to go there in the 1930s on our bicycles. They would pedal down here 8 miles on their bikes and picnic up on top of the hill." Because my dad's next question is, "Hey, can you find the place?" In those days, it was not open to the public. There was actually research going on by the Early Sites Foundation, but it was not open to the public. There was no visitor center, no road signs, there was no advertising for it. But it was kind of known, I guess, word of mouth. People knew about it. And they would come down here like my aunt and uncle did and go climb among the rocks, and into the chambers. And you can just imagine the fun that was, exploring it. So that next Sunday, the 4 of them took off in the car and they came down here, and because my aunt and uncle didn't exactly know where it was, and they drove around for a while, and they finally spotted an old dirt road, parked the car, and they decided to go up this road. They weren't sure if it was the right one. And when they get to the top of the hill, there's a site right in front of them, just kind of amazing that they found the place. My dad actually, so excited, he actually climbed under this chain link fence, which has barbed wire on top of it. The fence was put up by the first researcher in 1937, Mr. Goodwin, to protect the site, to keep people out of there from damaging it, from taking, souvenirs, artifacts and so forth. My dad found a hole under the fence and he climbed under it. The rest of them stayed outside. He disappeared for quite a while. When he came back out, of course, they were wondering what he thought. He said, "Wow, this place is mind blowing. This is amazing. I've never seen anything like this." And then he goes on to say something about, "Man, I would love to be involved with this somehow, maybe research, study, investigation, maybe even open it up to the public as a museum," which my mom responded right back, going like, "You got rocks in your head." So, and he did. He was an AT&T Bell Labs engineer by then in 1953, and he stayed at AT Bell Labs for 30 years. And before that, he was in the Coast Guard up in Labrador. And he actually listened to WBZ way up there up in Newfoundland, at the Loran station. It's a long range navigation for the Coast Guard. In fact, I guess it's coming back today because GPS has its, I was just reading an article about that. They had discontinued it the year my dad died in 2009. And now they're thinking of bringing it back as a backup to GPS. And I used to fly and I used GPS, there's some vulnerabilities to it being jammed and so forth. So Loran may be coming back. It's going to be an E-Loran, I guess. But anyway, he was right up near where the Vikings landed 1,000 years ago, Alonzo Meadow. And we are planning to go there in 2 weeks in an RV and drive 1,500 miles to see that site after all these years. Go back where my dad was based for a couple of years, back in the early 50s. They had discovered that site until 1960, so he didn't go over and look at it. He definitely would, because he was fascinated by history, about early Europeans coming over, maybe like the Vikings, also Native Americans too. So that was his kind of his passion anyway. So this site just fell into place for him. He met the owner after he heard of it, after he visited the site, and it was a gentleman from Massachusetts named Malcolm Pearson. And for the next 3 years, they worked out an agreement for my dad to actually lease the site and then open it to the public. And in 1958, they opened it as the Stone Ruins of New Hampshire.
Mhm.
So we've been open 65 years. This summer was our anniversary again. And I have a granddaughter now, so it's kind of like the fourth generation. She's there 4 days a week with my daughter-in-law, because she works for us too. My son and my daughter-in-law met in college, and she's been working there for almost 14 years. She just loves working there, and her daughter is going to turn 3. She was born on the day they did the OSL. We had 25 people up here on the team from the University of Washington, Brookhaven National Laboratory, 2 physicists from there, 2
Mhm.
state archaeologists, our own archaeologists. We had this big team here. In the meantime, my daughter-in-law had to take off for an emergency C-section. And that's on my mind while I'm working with all these people trying to get the cores. It was on 9/11 of all things too. 9/11, September 11th of all days, I wasn't flying that day back then. I was off Maine. We were going to go out and look at some inscriptions that might be Phoenician up in Booth Bay Harbor, Maine, back on 2001 on 9/11. I was on vacation that week and I didn't go back to work for about a month because of what happened. But anyway, my daughter-in-law was born on that day, and she's going to be turning 3. We can't forget her birthday for sure. And that's the day of the OSL dates. So a lot of cool stuff. We're still doing, research with modern equipment like LIDAR, ground penetration radar. We're using DNA on some bones that were found by Mr. Goodwin back in 1937. We're actually DNA on this year up in Thunder Bay, Canada. And the results were quite interesting, but we can't release them yet because we're carbon dating them at the moment.
Dennis, what does the OSL stand for?
Yeah, OSL is optically stimulated luminescence. So they take either rock or sediment, and it has to be it has to be kind of in a dark room environment when they take it. They can't expose it to light. So when they take the cores, you have to do it very, very carefully, whether it's a rock sample or it's a core of earth, And they usually put a tent over it. They collect, the specimens, and then they send them out to the laboratory, in this case, out to the University of Washington. And it used to take 5 years to get the results, a half a decade, and they're down to about 2 years now. And so we had that done in 2020, and last fall the results came back again, as I mentioned, that there were pre-colonial dates on the 2 samples that they took at our site, and some of the other samples all the way down to Virginia are starting to show pre-colonial, again, supporting a prehistoric age of these sites,
But
So do you have a website? Let's start there.
Yeah, we do have a website, and it's been going since 1995. It's stonehengeusa.com. And there's an email address in there. You can also watch our 11-minute video from our theater in there. And a lot of people do that before they go, because they might be a little short on time. They're traveling, having a vacation, they're with kids. But you can actually watch it in our theater, but the 11-minute video is on our website. It's also a free app download. And if you look at that, you can actually download it. It's a mobile app. You can actually do on your couch a complete tour of our site, and it will talk to you. It has pictures and text. If you're here and you use it, you can walk with it on your cell phone. And as you're walking along, everything's numbered, and it kind of corresponds to a 4-page paper map that we give you. But it has more information. And people really love that app. But you can do it in Hawaii and never visit us. It's all free. You can do that. And when you come in, you can download it and use it. There's also, we're on Facebook and we're on YouTube and stuff like that, and you can buy tickets online. They're a little bit cheaper if you buy them online too. So there's a lot of stuff on the website. They go to that, they can look at it, say, gee, I'm interested in that place, or, it's not quite my thing, it gives them a heads up before they come and visit us.
And what about accommodations?
they can stay in our caves, we can charge them a special fee. But actually Salem does have a lot of hotels and motels in the area.
Right.
We don't
But
rent
you
out
have camping on site, is that?
No, we don't, but we just got into RVing ourselves, and down the street is a Walmart. There's a Cracker Barrel up the street. There's a
Right.
couple of camping grounds. One of them is like 400 acres in the next town I came from, Adair. I mentioned that earlier. There's a great big campground there. They used to have the runway. They have a little airport there and a golf course. There's a couple other campgrounds nearby, and I understand they're kind of nice. I haven't stayed there because we've been camping away from here, actually. We will be up in Newfoundland. But and Salem has a brand new Marriott Optician, I think they call it, opening up this fall. It's a gigantic complex. If we ever have a huge conference here, which we've had up in Vermont, 1,200 people showed up in 1977 for a 3-day conference. And then down at Brown University, they did a thing about our site and all these sites back about 20 years ago called the ABC, Across Before Columbus Conference. And they had like 1,000. Our area will be able to accommodate a big conference. We have a beautiful golf course. It has a hotel there too, with convention rooms. So there are places for people to stay. There's 100 restaurants in Salem itself, and then more restaurants around. So if you come into the area, camping, hotels, motels, lots of food.
But when you said you can stay in our caves, you weren't serious.
Yeah, I was kind of joking there. I don't know if it didn't, maybe I stick with my day job, because the chambers kind of look like the Flintstones homes, kind of that design with big stone roofs, stone walls, kind of like Skara Brae in the Orkney Isles in Scotland, which was actually a habitat site. It's one of the few sites in Western Europe, and there are about 50,000 megalithic sites going back from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age, and we've been to many of them, and most of them are ceremonial sites like Stonehenge. People didn't really live there. They lived near it, but not on it. But Skara Brae was one of the exceptions, and there's another one called Stanleyville, I think it's called. It was another stone site that people lived in. And the reason for that is they didn't have much wood on the Orkney Islands to build, so they used stone. And it's preserved, 5,000 years old. It's preserved because it was covered by a storm, we think, thousands of years ago. 1800s, it was uncovered by another storm, and it was like a time capsule. And it showed how maybe the wooden villages looked, which of course they decomposed, But our site kind of looks like the Flintstones homes in some cases. So, people might say, hey, maybe we did when we were kids. We used to stay overnight up there when we were kids, when we were, back 50 years ago. I don't want to date myself, but I was around 18 and 19. We stayed in the Oracle Chamber. We had a lot of guides back in those days, more guides than we have today. And we're all kids, and we would stay overnight and watch like the Planet of the Apes on the sacrificial table, if you would. We had electricity up there, a little black and white TV. We sat there in 1972, watched, I think it was 1968 or whenever the first one came out. We were watching it probably on one of the main networks back then, obviously, So we have stayed overnight there too. But no, it's not open to the public, but there are nearby camping areas. And we just had a Class C RV, a beautiful one, pulled in today. And I'd like to talk to those people too and get recommendations, when people are RVing in here. What is a nice place, how much, that kind of thing. But a lot of that, you can just Google it too,
So Mark, I understand you have some written materials that dovetail into this.
Yeah. Dennis, you were just talking about the kind of nebulous pre-colonial dates. Okay. But in your one of the guidebooks you have, you do have a drawing about where some of the artifacts were found, and professionally radiocarbon tested, and you get one date. I think it's the lower date, about 1800 BC.
Right, Mark. Yeah, that book came out in 1996 by one of our staff persons. She was actually a Spanish high school teacher, and she joined us in the mid 90s, and she wrote our very first souvenir book. We've had other textbooks. I call them textbooks, but full books on our site starting in 1946. In my book, hopefully,
are these books available anywhere off-site, or are they strictly available in your gift shop?
you can buy them, I think, in Kindle. I think my wife is more in that, and my daughter-in-law are more in marketing, but I know people buy them online.
Yeah, that one.
So I believe it's. I think. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
Is this one at the gift shop?
Yeah, that one's from 2003. That was written by my dad and David Goldsworth at the time. That one we do not have. We sold the last one just probably 2 or 3 years ago because the publisher actually he didn't do any more. I guess I think he retired, and we don't have any more of those. But about 5 years ago, I started planning on writing a new book, updating it with all the new finds we found in the last few years. And right now I have somebody helping me, one of our staff people helping me get the book completed. So hopefully by the end of the year, we hope to have a new book out. 1946, Goodwin wrote the first book. It's one of his 4 books he wrote. That was called The Ruins of Great Ireland and New England. And then 1977, Mark Feldman and my dad put together a book, Mystery Hill book, the book you just held up from 2003. And then we'll have a new one put out. But there have been many, many, many books written about the site by other authors, but they usually include other sites. So my book might mention some other sites, but I'll be focused on America's Stonehenge. And the book you held up was a souvenir book. My daughter-in-law, Kat, and I put together a brand new souvenir book about 3 years ago, I think. So there is a book that supersedes that now. And that book is no longer available. I don't think you can get used copies probably on online, maybe like on Kindle. There may be some used copies, or I'm not sure where you get them, but they're no longer in print right now, that particular book.
Now, how did the name America's Stonehenge get linked to the site? What was the thought behind that?
So I mentioned the stone ruins in New Hampshire, but in 58, 59, my dad changed it to Mystery Hill Caves, which stayed to 1963. The hill never really had an official name on the geodesic maps. People called it Patty's Hill, the family that lived there. It had other names, but now it's called Mystery Hill. So my dad's naming the place Mystery Hill Caves. The USGS decided to use that for the official name of the hill. In 1963, we dropped the word caves because people thought they were natural cabins or caves, And so the word became Mystery Hill. The name, I should say, became Mystery Hill. So still the stone ruins in New Hampshire doing business as now Mystery Hill. But in 1959, Saturday Evening Post did a full feature on us, the second year we were open. And the author of that article actually called us the Stonehenge of America. So it's kind of a nickname. And that's before we knew he had one astronomical alignment. We knew the stones were out in the woods, these monoliths, but we had no idea at that point. And again, it wasn't until 1965. So because of the big stones in our site, the author was reminded of Stonehenge. So he kind of nicknamed it that unofficially. But Saturday Evening Post became a big thing. They even had a Saturday Evening Post, Mystery Hill Caves in 1959, I think it was. And the Rockingham Racetrack, which was a big racetrack where Seabiscuit raced. It was going for 100 years. It's no longer open. It's now a Tuscan Village marketplace. It's got a lot of cool stuff, but unfortunately the track's gone. They had a whole thing for our place. They even had a book, it was Mystery Hill Caves, and our manager at the time was given a copy because a horse, I think, won, I guess. But now in 1965, we started doing the astronomical work. And by 1983, I think I was in 82, excuse me, I was up in Vermont flying for an airline for 3 years, my first airline. I was there for 3 years. And during that time, my dad and other staff members and the family decided to take the name America's Stonehenge. And it was better to identify the function of the site, not the form, but the function of the site, because it is astronomically aligned. We had surveyed the alignment starting in 1973. A gentleman named Charlie Pearson was a surveyor. He worked for his dad. His dad's name was Beverly Pearson, and it was Beverly Pearson Associates of Derry, New Hampshire. And he was like the president of New England Surveyors Association. We hired somebody very reputable. By 73, even though the work began in 65, we realized we needed a professional surveyed map, very, very accurate. So he came up in 73, he began his project, and we paid him as we could. So he didn't finish it, the first phase of the 15 acres where all the alignments are located, until 1977. And in 77, we sent that data to the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. And during the course of the winter, we have the name of the person. I think it was Rosenberg. I have the file. They put it through their computer. I think today on my cell phone, we could actually have an app and it would do all of that immediately. But they put it through their computer, and they said that if these were used for astronomical purposes, these marker stones, they would work about 1800 BC plus or minus about 250 years. And that's because the Earth's axis, that tilt of it is about 23.5 degrees today. I think it's 23 degrees, 26 minutes, I think, today. But it goes through a 41,000-year cycle called the obliquity cycle. The other cycle more people are familiar with is precession of the equinoxes every 25,920 years. We have both things going on, of course. So they said due to the Earth's tilt, today it's off a little bit. When would it work? You have to go back to about 1800 BC. And that agreed with the 1971 carbon dating that Mark was holding up. That 1800 BC date, he mentioned, agreed with the Harvard date. And it was plus or minus factor on both. So 1971, we got the carbon dating, one of the 12. And we got two others of the main, what we call the main site, where that chain link fence surrounds about 1 acre of the main site. 3,000-year-old dates on two charcoal samples. So two 3,000-year-old and then a 4,000-year-old charcoal sample in these diagram that Mark showed you, where the charcoal is located. They found hammerstones, rubbing stones, stone scrapers, stone spalls, where somebody had been working the stone with percussion flaking, actually using Stone Age tools, not metal tools. Below that, the bedrock had been removed. So the bedrock was removed. A chamber called the Chamber in Ruins, which is still standing with its roof fallen in today. It's about a 7,000-pound roof slab that caved in.
Right.
But on the north wall of that's where they, in 67, they found a piece of the white pine tree that was there in the 1930s and photographed by Mr. Goodwin and Malcolm Pearson. And 30 years later, they went in, they actually photographed it. They took out the root. It was growing through the wall. And the idea is you don't build a structure around the pine tree. The pine tree grows through the structure. That dated to 1690 AD, showing that the Patty family that was living up there in the 1800s couldn't have built the site, which is one of the mainstream's theories. Oh, it was all built by these farmers. They were really shoemakers. He was a 5th-generation shoemaker, but they call him a farmer. And he did some farming, like everybody did back then. But in 69, they dug down and they hit a lot of sterile soil initially, and then they got down. And we have all of that data and the schematics and the reports, and they get down. And all of a sudden, they were kind of disappointed because they weren't hitting anything. It was like 3 layers of soil to stratigraphy. And then all of a sudden they started hitting charcoal and they started hitting some of the stone tools. That was in 69, and that dated to 3,000 years old. 2 years later in 71, they dug adjacent to that and they continued down to hit the bedrock. And then they found the bedrock had been quarried. So the original builders actually quarried off the bedrock, and then they built the structure, and then soil very slowly builds up. And at some point, somebody was doing some work next to the structure. It left behind the hammerstone, rubbing stones, stone scrapers, and the stone spallings. So
with all of that, what is your personal sense of why? Why was this built with the alignments and all that?
Yeah, I think the site is a ceremonial site. Again, not a domicile site. I think people came up here. They might have come up here in the solstices. They came up on the equinoxes. And we also have 4 other alignments. Not everybody's familiar with, but you'll recognize some of them. The cross-quarter days are days in between the seasons. They call it the mid-season alignments. Halloween is the day before Samhain, the ancient Celtic holiday, today called All Saints Day, November 1st. We have that alignment. And that was the beginning of winter for many cultures, not December 21st, that's midwinter. And then you go to February 1st, Imbolc by the Celts, I'm probably mispronouncing it, but also that day's around Candlemas and Groundhog's Day, kind of a modernized version. That's beginning of spring. And then we have the May Day, which ancient culture, like Celts called the Beltane or Beltane. The fires of Beltane, the beginning of summer, the end of spring. You get to summer solstice, that was used to be called midsummer solstice. Today we call it the first day of summer. And it has a name too. And then we go to August 1st, which was 2 days ago. We just had a drumming circle. And we have alignments, actually stone markers for all these positions for the sun. So there's 8 positions, we have them for the sunrise, the sunset for the sun. We also have the moon, and they were interested in the moon. And some of the ancient cultures were more like matriarchal rather than patriarchal. But they say during the time of agriculture, the sun became very important because of crops, kind of more of the male, versus the ancients with the female goddesses and stuff like that. And Stonehenge seems to be an overlap, a time going from like the female deity being quite important with the moon in the hunter-gatherer societies, if you would, into the agricultural societies, and may have been longing for the old ways, but also accepting the new ways, male, female. And I think the site, people would gather on those days, but maybe during a funeral, because a couple chambers look to me exactly what I've seen in France, also in Ireland, and they're in Spain too. And I've been to Spain, although I didn't get to the megalithic sites. They're just some of the most, I got to get back over there. So they might have been burial structures. Right now, some bones have been out from that area, and they've been DNA'd, and they're not animal. And that was something I thought, well, they're probably animal. They were looked at in 1968 by the Smithsonian. A woman teacher in the area actually nicely brought them down to the Smithsonian in 68. She brought down several bones, a couple from the main site, a couple from the watch house, which is a satellite structure about 300 feet from the main site. And a woman, physical anthropologist, Dr. Lucille, if I get her name right, St. Hoyen, looked at them very carefully, and we got all her reports and everything. She goes, although back then they didn't have DNA, but my best guess that these are human. She goes, animal bones are generally denser, harder, this and that. She goes, human bones are usually a little softer, but these are on the hard side of that. So she was not 100% sure, but she says at the end of it, personally, I believe these are human, the 3 bones, and they're found close together. One of them had scratch marks, which was done while the person was alive. Was that an injury, perhaps? What are they doing on the site when the whole hilltop's bedrock? The whole 110 acres is bedrock with a very thin soil covering. It's not like if it was a we'll find out how old the bones are shortly. We should hear any day now. So she looked at them, and then she gave her best guess. They came back to us. We had to sign papers that we received them. And a couple other bones she looked at from the watch house. She goes, I think these are bison, buffalo. And that was her best guess. She showed them to her male colleague. His name was John. I forget the last name. He was a mammologist, I guess it is. He knew about animal bones. She let him look at them, and without saying anything, where they were from, what she thought they were. He goes, oh, I think these are possibly, and not 100%, but I think these are bison or buffalo. She goes, well, they're from New Hampshire, And he goes, yeah, if you go back in time, the buffalo were much more widespread across North America. The woodland bison. And what the heck are they doing in that chamber too? I don't know, but they're inside that chamber. And so this year, a friend of mine from Malibu, he does books, he does lectures, goes all over the world. He had done the Paracas skulls in South America, those shaped skulls. He actually did the DNA on those. They're kind of controversial. He used a laboratory up in Thunder Bay, Canada. So I said, maybe these will be good candidates for DNA. So we were going to initially send all 3 of them up there separately in separate boxes in case the mail system lost them, because these are precious to us. They've been around for 85 years. But we decided to keep one in our museum. We kept it on display for safekeeping, and we sent the other 2 up there. It's rather expensive to have the DNA done too. So they went up there. It's a laboratory. It's part of a university, Lake Point, I think it is. University, I'd have to double check that. But it's a husband and wife that run the lab. And for 2 months, the bones were gone, and then we got the results back, and they were not animal. Dr. Lucille St. Hoyen was correct. They were human, but they were not Native American, and Native American in New Hampshire now goes back about 13,000 years, right during the Ice Age. That's pretty phenomenal. They were not African or African American, because the Patty family that was there, they actually helped with the Underground Railway. So anything's possible with that. They were not Asian either. So it leaves another race from another part of the world, and both bones were both related to each other, either the same person or the very, very, like descendants of the same mom or whatever, No nuclear DNA was found. And I didn't know if we could have them DNA'd. They've been out of the ground for 85 years, but they were. So my next question was to the laboratory that did our initial carbon datings back in 67, all the way up to 95. We used them for 9 of the carbon datings. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in the University of Washington did 3 others for us. So I asked the original laboratory that my dad worked, and the son is actually running it now. The dad had passed away, I guess, in 1992. I didn't realize that, Dr. Harold Kruger. So his son's running the lab. It's a family business, I guess. I said, can we date these old bones? They've been exposed to the elements since 1937. And I explained how he had them DNA'd. He goes, I think they'll make great candidates. He goes, it's not when they're out of the ground, it's when they're in the ground where bones and other material decompose, and it's really damaging to them. I said, what about background radiation? We used to put them in cigarette packs with aluminum to keep the radiation away from them. I remember when I was a kid, he said that was for convenience. They made a nice little place to protect the charcoal and then ship them in that, they'd probably tape it up and then they would ship. He goes, but the aluminum foil for the cigarettes wouldn't actually, protect them. And you don't want a lot of organic material touching the bones too, because they have to clean them. It contaminates them. Mm-hmm. So right now, the bones went to that laboratory, and what he did with them is he prepared them, and they're now down in Tucson, Arizona. And they're going to be particle acceleration test, mass accelerator spectrometry test. Mm-hmm. It's a more accurate way than carbon dating. It's about $590 a sample. So we did is we took one of the two and we sent that. If that does not test, we'll send the other. If that doesn't test for whatever reason, we'll have to look at that third bone, which has not been touched yet. We might have to take and DNA it and then do that. But each time you lose some of the bone samples. So as far as an artifact, you start losing that, So my friend is actually underwriting some of it. We're underwriting some of it too. And it's so nice of him. I'm going to let him have the first, press release, I guess, on that whenever we get the results back. He's a really nice guy. In fact, he's supposed to call me later today. And again, we should be hearing about the dating on that anytime now. So we may have some human bones that will actually have some date. If it's historic, it's like, why was this particular person from this part of the world on our hilltop and they just left them there? Even if it was 200 or 300 years ago, who would let him or her rot on the ground? Why would you do that? There's no soil cover. It's from no soil to just a few inches of soil where they were found. And that's what they were found in, probably out of the structure. So this probably have more questions than answers, but if it's prehistoric, I think that's going to be really, I don't know what to say. I think it's going to be pretty interesting, and it'll be
the one thing we haven't touched is what if they are terrestrial?
Right. I mean, while we are interested in that phenomena, I have seen a couple of interesting things on that line. I don't know. You do some shows on, on UFOs or UAPs.
Yes.
Well, back in 1970, Hans Holzer started coming up and became a friend of the families. And in 74, he brought in Ethel Myers Johnson on November 12th. My mom picked him up at the Manchester, New Hampshire airport, where I learned how to fly. And she visited our site. Somehow Betty Hill, of Bonnie and Betty Hill fame, the famous couple, heard about it. She came down to get a reading by Ethel Myers Johnson. Who was very, very elderly at the time. She passed away, I think, in the 70s, but she was a famous psychic that Hans brought in. That was one of three that he brought in that year. He would fly up from New York City. My mom would pick him up each time. Well, I asked Hans Holzer's daughter. She visited us 3 years ago when they did the Holzer Files show on us. They were there all week from California with people from all over actually doing the show. Scott Walters came in from Minneapolis. David Schrader's from Minneapolis to host. And she came up in New York City. She usually did her little thing on that show for 2 years from her home, I think. So she actually came in and I said to the producers, can't you bring her up? I'd like to meet her. I knew her dad, She was a baby at the time when he came up in the early 70s. And she did come in and it kind of shocked me when I was ready to leave in the middle of the week, about 10 o'clock at night. We've been there all day and I got to get home because I got to work the next day there. And they would be there all night filming. And I walk out the back door and I said hi to I thought it was just one of the crew. And, their crew was wonderful. I said, hi, and she goes, hi, I'm Alexandra Holzer. And I'm like, whoa, So I asked her recently, do you have that reading by Ethel Myers on Betty Hill? And her dad has so many recordings and so many film that he shot that she said, I have it. I got to go through this. I got to go through all of his records, and if I find that, it should be interesting to see what Ethel Myers said about Betty Hill's, past, I guess, Right. Travis Walton's been to our site. I met him twice and I did a VIP with him. I took him around, personally around the site. I met him at the Exeter, New Hampshire UFO Festival in 2018, I think. And then
you're definitely open to the concept that this may have a link to visitors from off planet.
Right. I don't know. I know there's an interest in that. I know that UFO activity in New Hampshire is very high. It's the fifth, I think, most per population in the country. But maybe the ancient people that built our site was inspired by the heavens for one thing, constellations, and maybe there's some inspiration from extraterrestrials. Like we were on Ancient Aliens 2019. It was aired on July 19th, my mom's 100th birthday. She died just a few days before that. She didn't want to hit 100. She told my daughter-in-law the year before, I'm not going to, and she didn't. So she lived she was a friend of Betty Hill's for 30 years, actually, though. They stayed in touch until Betty died about 20 years ago. But anyway, I'm interested in the phenomena. I saw things both mostly on the ground, and around this hilltop. And one of the most spectacular ones I saw was February last year, about 9 o'clock. I'm looking at our Palladium window, looking west to the south of the Manchester airport, and I see a bright light. I said, well, maybe it's a landing light. I don't see any strobe lights. I don't see any position lights, logo lights, or anything like a landing lights or anything like that. So I'm looking at it for about 3 seconds or so. All of a sudden, it went down vertically, instantaneous toward the ground. It was amazing. I have asked Kathleen Marden, Betty Hill's niece, who wrote the books with Stanton Friedman, and she was big in MUFON. She's in Florida now, and I stay in contact with her occasionally. And I said, have you ever heard of a UAP going to the ground below the Manchester airport? There's just not the Merrimack River, that's further over. It's not even that deep a river, but all these little brooks and streams below the Manchester airport and a couple little ponds. I said, there's nothing there to conceal a UFO to go into, it's not like one of the Great Lakes or something. I said, she goes, only in Skinwalker Ranch and also Reptilian was her answer to me. But she's been to our site too. Kathy Marden used to come here with Betty back in the 70s, and she's got an open invitation to come back. She said, I am going to come back up and see the place almost 50 years after she was last year, maybe 45 years ago or so. So I saw that one. And then we saw one where Betty Hill was born in Kingston, New Hampshire. That's about 10 miles east of us. We were coming back from an ice cream place, my wife and I. My wife's not into UFOs. She's not particularly interested one way or the other, kind of neutral. So I'm going through an intersection. Unfortunately, it was a green light, so we went through it. If we had stopped, we could have looked at it. It was to the right. It was this dark object, very pointed, very sharp lines in it. But my mind thought maybe a KC-135 from Pease International Trade Port, the National Guards there. And I was actually based there for 3 years in my flying career about 30 years ago. But they replaced those with 767s recently, and all those planes are a little rounder. The little, they're not really pointed and jagged. And the F-117 is more like that. This thing was hanging in the air with what would look like its nose pointed down, but it was only like 2 or 3 seconds I saw it, so I couldn't really focus on it. I was driving. My wife saw it a little bit longer. For the rest of the ride home, my wife's neck was like, she was looking to the right, I think straining her neck. She was blown away by whatever it was. I went to the MUFON site the next day, and I couldn't find it was old information. Nobody had updated it for a while. Whatever it wasn't some sort of like an advertising blimp. It wasn't an airplane. And I flew for 42 years, about 30,000 hours of flying, and 727s and Embraer jets and everything. And I've never seen anything like that. It was right, and it was in her hometown, So that was in about 10 miles from here. So, but it's an interesting phenomenon to us. It always has been.
I'm going to stop you for a minute because, Mark, I understand you need to leave us. It's about 5 to 6. Thank you very much for your contribution. And is there anything you want to leave us with?
The one question I have is, since we've been talking about all these ancient dates, what evidence of old world people can be found at America's Stonehenge?
That's a great question, Mark. We have the trapezoid shapes we've been finding since we used LiDAR 3 years ago, and that can be an old world, but it can also be something found in Mexico or South America. But also we have a standard unit of measure that we've been looking at since the 70s. And I did a diorama on the site in 1977, went up and took some measurements, and it looked like a unit called the megalithic yard might fit back then. We did quite a bit of measuring for that diorama, which is on display when you walk into our building today. It's all been updated though. I was doing that in college. The megalithic yard is 3264 inches or 83 centimeters. And so that's something interesting. But back in the 1930s, when William Goodwin was doing the initial work on the site in 37, Roscoe Whitney, his right-hand man, was an engineer from MIT. And he had a plane table, he did cross-section plan view and profiles of the site. And he said, whoever built this site either didn't give a damn or know about linear measurements, because I've looked at the height, width, and depth of these structures in imperial measurements such as the inch, the foot, the yard, the ancient, the historical rod does
Mhm.
not fit any of these. And he did not know about the megalithic yard. It hadn't been discovered until Dr. Alexander Thom of Scotland found it. We have met Dr. Thom. He passed away in '85. We had supper with him in Scotland back in '82. He and his son, Dr. Archibald Thom, and they were both fascinated by our site with the astronomy in particular. But the megalithic yard hadn't quite come up yet at our site, even though we were I might have asked some questions because I had already made the diorama about 5 years before that. But we have inscriptions too. The inscriptions are found in the 60s and 70s, and they're on display in our museum. You can come and see them. And Dr. Barry Feld visited us in 1975. He was from New Zealand, went to school in Edinburgh, Scotland, came to the US and became a professor at Harvard University for a couple decades. His passion was ancient inscriptions. And I think he could read like 17 ancient scripts, and he could speak like 6 modern languages too.
Mhm.
He wrote America, BC in 1976. 1 year after he first visited us. But it's not just about our site, it's about other sites in the Northeast and inscriptions, including going up actually into Canada and even further out west to Alberta, Canada. What he found, these markings were, at our site, were 3 types. One of them was Phoenician, one of them was Libyan, and one of them was Ogham or Ogham. And he said that they actually were Iberic. They were from Spain and Portugal, and he said that was a melting pot. The Phoenicians were there, the Celts were there, the Libyans came over there, and they were actually multilingual. They probably intermarried. And he believes the Iberian Peninsula was a launching spot, like Columbus launched off of it to the New World. He thinks the ancient Phoenicians did too. And the Phoenician writing's been found from Maine down to Brazil, 1872. Some slaves down there actually doing some work, saw some unusual markings, and they brought it to the attention, which is really wonderful. They did that, but nobody paid attention, unfortunately, to much later. And I think it was Dr. Cyrus Thompson that actually, I think I got the name right, Cyrus Thompson. He looked at him and said that the Phoenicians describing a maritime operation bringing goods in or something like that. He's got the whole translation. It's quite interesting. But some of these markings go all the way out to the Milk River in Alberta, Canada. And even in California, there's markings too. Native Americans left behind petroglyphs and pictographs, beautiful artwork. Even in Vermont, there's some of that. But this seems to be something different. This seems to be old world markings. There's some other Semitic writings too, found across the Americas. The estimate I heard is there's 3,000 unknown markings in North America and about the same in South America. I don't know how accurate that statement is. I just read that recently. I wish I could say that's 100% accurate, but there are many. There are many that should not be here. And it goes back before the time of the Vikings. Goodwin thought the Irish Caldi monks built our site, and they were escaping Viking persecution. We went to Iceland last year, and they do talk about the Vikings being there somewhere around 780 or 800 AD. And that's a little earlier than I thought. But they talk about a Greek merchant from Marseille, France. He was a Phocian, not a Phoenician. And he went by the gates of Gibraltar in 306 BC, getting around the Phoenician blockade. The Phoenicians controlled trade, and they blockaded the Straits of Gibraltar, which I've been by. We went down to Morocco on a ship, from Spain. It's a pretty cool area, but they blocked it. But they made it past there. He went up to the Scilly Islands to a trade fair, and then they said, "Want to go north?" And he said, "Sure." So he was on his Greek wooden boat, following these hide-covered boats, the kuraks. He could not keep up with them. They lowered their mast, and they were frustrated because he couldn't keep up. Finally, they said, "Get on our ship. We're faster." And apparently went up past the Faroe Islands, and they think the people in Iceland think they visited there. And one thing about that guy too, he was one of the first in writing, I guess, to say that the tides are caused by the moon, the tide cycle each day. Maybe people in the Stone Age knew that too, living on the coast perhaps, but he was one of the first ones to document that. His name was Pythias, and his name comes up in Iceland. In Iceland, I just fell in love with the place. There's so much history there. But before the Vikings, I think the Irish monks were up here too. And then they may have made it into the New World. And that was Goodwin's idea, that the site was 1,000 years old. It was an Irish Caldi monk monastery. They had the abbot living there. And ours was a center with all these satellites. He knew of 16 others back in the 1930s and 40s. When his book came out in 46, he lists 16 other sites around New England. It explains everything. He does a pretty good job. He's a he went to Yale. He went to St. Paul's School in New Hampshire and everything. And his first cousin was J.P. Morgan. And with Morgan and he, before Morgan died, I think in 1913, they put together an antique collection that's still at the Wadsworth Antitheum in Hartford, Connecticut. That's where Morgan was living. And then Goodwin died in 1950. So they were quite a spread in age, but they did put that together when Goodwin was young. And I got letters from Goodwin to J.P. Morgan's dad, talking back and forth. So it was part of that family. And Goodwin just got involved with these sites. He lived in Columbus, Ohio, looking at the mounds for 15 years, documenting the location for the highway department. He did that for 15 years. That was over 100 years ago. Finally, he retired. He was an insurance executive, moved back to Hartford in 1931. He retires. Then he hears about the site 5 years later. He visits a couple sites, like the one in Hopkinton, Mass. That's where the Boston Marathon starts every year, kind of a big thing. There's chambers there, and then Acton, and then he visits the Upton Chamber in Upton, Mass. That is now available. It's part of a park, and that was Malcolm Pearson's family's home right there. So that's how Malcolm Pearson got involved. His family bought it 100 years ago, and Malcolm was 16 and says, "Young man, there's a foundation or a cellar out back." And Malcolm goes out there, and there's this beautiful beehive kind of structure. Actually, it looks like an igloo, and they call it a passage grave in Europe, kind of like Newgrange in Ireland I've been to. When you walk into it, I was there like 2 years ago looking at it again. But Malcolm's family owned that until 1970. But by 65, my dad had bought the site entirely from Malcolm because he had leased the 20 acres, but he had been buying the land around it to protect everything. So by 1965, Malcolm at that time owned the site still until the sale was final. So at that point in 65, his family owned the Upton Chamber in Upton, Mass. It's about 60 miles from here, which is kind of famous today. It's been on a number of TV shows, and our site too. It was in that same family, you know. In 65, my dad took possession, and Malcolm remained a friend of the family's all the rest of the years. He died at about 100 years ago. I'm sorry, 100 years of age. He died about 12 years ago. I think 2011 at 100 years old. So he had a long life, and he was always interested in it. He was a professional photographer. So he photographed our site. I still have negatives that had never been developed. I have glass slides, you know, the plastic ones.
Yeah.
They had glass before. I have those. The collection for our site and probably maybe 15 or 20 other sites around the region from the late 30s, including aerial shots. I used to love to go up in a plane and shoot our site and other sites from the air. We have all those records. And then we have records of our site going back to 1900, photographic records of it. We also have 4 photographs from 1920. And then in 1935, the Haverhill Gazette, a local newspaper, sent up a photographer, a reporter, and he took pictures of the site with a guy named, who was actually a Reverend Ward. And this Reverend Ward standing at our site, he had an interest in it, with a whole site in the background. Because some people say, we don't know what Goodwin did. Of course we do. And we have photographs of Malcolm, you know, from the very beginning in 36 when he first visited. 37, he bought the 20 acres, and then he hired a crew, put up a wooden shack. It was like a bunkhouse, and people started cleaning, excavating, and that's when those bones were found, and doing repairs. But all of that was recorded, and we got photographs 1935, 1920, and 1900. So we know exactly what the site looks like. And Roscoe Whitney was there with his plane table doing all the profiles. We have all that data. And after Roscoe got done, probably around 1940, Vincent Fagan came in a year or so later from Notre Dame College, and he began doing the same thing, mapping the site. And it was kind of after a lot of the repairs were made, you know. So we have a pretty good record of our site. But I think it's ceremonial.
Getting back to the inscriptions, are they fairly accessible?
They are. They're on display in our visitor center. We have a couple displays with different, actually several different inscriptions, including it was a monolith. The stone is about 7 feet tall. It has a little nodule cut on the top of it, like a lot of our monoliths. The top of it has a notch on the top of it. It was found in 1975, about probably 500 feet north of the main site by one of our researchers. He was just out there. He was always in the woods looking for stuff. And he happened to see this stone. Another stone, a little bit shorter, but almost like a twin, had fallen on top of it. So the main stone with the writing on the side of it, it goes up and down the side of it, had fallen. The other stone had fallen on top of it, almost concealing the inscriptions. In 75, we looked at it, they photographed it, and they decided to move the stone to the building for protection. And they took the first stone off. We think they were originally both standing like this. The stone is still standing and leaning against a tree from 1975, and the tree's kind of grown into it. The other stone is now standing up. It weighs hundreds and hundreds of pounds. It actually had split in two. So my son he's an engineer at Raytheon. He's on the Patriot missile, and he's worked for Dean Kamen on the all sorts of cool stuff that Dean did. He did the Segway and all that stuff, but he's worked on autonomous delivery vehicles. But my son's an engineer like my dad was, and he's also a rally car racer. So he lifts up engines, he builds cars. He was just racing in Chillicothe. We met up with him at the Serpent Mountain when his team was out there racing. And then he raced up in Sunday River, Maine, but he knows how to lift stuff up. So they brought over his engine, lift, and we actually lifted the stone up. We wanted to do it back in 1975, which is 48 years ago. So I think about 2 to 3 years ago, we decided to get the lift in there. We actually lifted the whole thing up. I mean, it's really heavy and pretty big. And we got the whole thing upright the way we originally stood, we think. And you can see the whole inscription on the side of it. You can actually come in and see that. You can look in our display cases and see both the actual stone inscriptions, and there's a plaster cast next to it, because it's a little more, we actually painted the lines in there, or not we, but somebody else did. It was actually Dr. Barry Fell that did that.
But
Dr.
the stone itself is in your visitor center?
Yeah, it's a standing monolith in our visitor center. It's secure. It won't fall on that.
It'd be interesting. Cool. Glenda may be able to read that.
It is. And what Dr. Barry Fell's interpretation is that it says 39 La. 39 La, and La, I believe, was the word for day. And he says it's Celtic Ogum is how we pronounce it, but it's Ogham, and it's on the side. And what it refers to is Beltane. And at that time, around the way it was written was XXX V I. The later way they would do the 9 would be to put I before the X. So XXXIX. But there was a certain time in history where they would have just done the the XXX for 30, and then they put V, and then they put 4 I's after it. And Barry Fell identified that as a certain time in Roman history, because there were Roman numerals, and why the Celts would have been using that. He gives a whole background on that, because without that, it's like, wait a minute, Roman numerals and a Celtic thing, talking about Beltane, which is around, actually probably on May 4th. But due to the precession of the equinoxes, it's no longer 39 days after the spring equinox. I think I used to know the number of days. It's changed a little bit.
Right.
But he said this represents the vernal equinox, and this represents Beltane. And that was very, very important to some ancient cultures. And that stone's supposed to represent that. And it's about a little over 2,000 years old, he thinks that particular inscription is. Some of the other inscriptions go back, I think, as far as 800 BC, I think. So there's a time period that our site was used, not unlike Stonehenge, where there was 1,500 years, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 ABC. And we were just at some of the mounds out west, like the Great Serpent Mound, and they have dates from 300 BC, which is Adena, to
Dennis, I don't want to have to interrupt you, but we are out of time.
Oh, okay.
I want to thank you very much. Glenda has to say goodbye, and we will put your information up, for people to be able to access.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It went by fast.
It did, because it's so interesting. And I am sure that once people see this, they're going to be visiting and getting all that information from the website and all that. Do want to say thank you. And we'll definitely have you back so we could hear more about it and hear all the results that you may have come up with. So thank you, Dennis. Thank you to our audience. And please keep coming back and watching our programs. Every week we bring somebody different.
And stay with us, Dennis, after we close.
Thank you.
I will. Thank you very much.
Blessings, and we love you. Bye.